Ghosts of the Deep has stirred up some interesting conversations over the last few weeks surrounding what an ideal dungeon should be. Some people love the depth of the lore and the story implications that this dungeon provides, while others are more focused on gameplay and find repeat clears of the lengthy water transitions to be somewhat boring. Some love the more challenging boss fights, while others claim they're just bullet sponges that desperately need to be nerfed. The community will never unanimously agree on a favorite dungeon, but now that we have 7 of them in the game, I thought it'd be fun to make an updated tier list similar to the one I made last year. But this time, we were joined by hundreds of viewers live on Twitch, weighing their opinions against my own to make the final rankings as fair and unbiased as possible. But you know what's not fair? The fact that streaming services hide thousands of shows and movies from you simply because of your geographic location. And those same companies then hike up their prices year after year. Lucky for us, today's sponsor, ExpressVPN, makes sure that you're always getting your money's worth. Using streaming services without a VPN is like going to Chipotle and only having the option to order a cheese quesadilla. Now don't get me wrong, cheese quesadillas are fire, but you're missing out on so much more. Remember when The Office was on Netflix all those years and now it's just gone? Well, it's not. It's just region locked. With ExpressVPN, I was able to peel back the curtain on all of these hidden shows, including the likes of Dragon Ball Z, Friends, and even Lord of the Rings. Pair this with the fact that ExpressVPN also protects my information when browsing online, and this was a no-brainer for me. To sign up, go to expressvpn.com/above and get an extra 3 months for free. Thank you to ExpressVPN for sponsoring today's video. Now let's get back to the tier list. Should we get started? What dungeon do we want to start with? Okay, so yeah, chat, I guess we can start with like a mid-level dungeon. So we'll just have a placeholder for Root of Nightmares. Bagel can just kind of edit this in. We'll put Root down in C tier. Mechanics, a little too basic for my liking. We'll start with one that kind of falls in the middle of the road for me. I think we're going to start with Grasp of Avarice, and I'm going to put it in B. I don't think it's the best dungeon they've released. I don't think it's the worst dungeon they've released. And I think it does some things well and other things not great at all. I really like the theme and the music of the dungeon. I think it's really, really well done. The pirate theme is dope, and the first clear going through this too was really cool with the trapdoors and the sparrow encounter, and like when you're in the sparrow encounter going towards the skull, almost like you're in I don't know, like Tomb Raider or something like that. That was pretty sick, I'm not gonna lie. One of the encounters that kills it for me is the servitor encounter, actually featured in this image right there. I feel like it just takes way too long. I don't think the mechanics they put into Grasp are that inventive, because it's legitimately just Gambit, but they used engrams. I don't think they really like innovated on mechanics in this dungeon specifically. But I think for the aesthetic and story, I think it did a really, really cool job, totally differentiating itself. The loot I think is good because obviously you had Galley, which is one of the best exotic weapons in the game. That automatically bumps the loot up into a solid standing for me. You also have, it's a very, honestly, the loot's very like PvP centric. You have Matador, which is like extremely meta as a shotgun right now. Ias Luna, which is good. I wouldn't call it like a meta hand cannon. I mean, there's just so many hand cannons that are similar. I don't think Ias Luna like stands out in any way. I think the same is like for 1,000-Yard Stare. The Sword Hero of Age is actually pretty good with the chain reaction, but I don't know how many people actually use it. I think the armor looks super cool. I'm not a huge fan of the helmets, but I think like individual pieces from this set are really cool. The only issue with the Artifice armor from this dungeon is that it was very low stat. The armor was typically dropping anywhere from like 58 to 62, which like if you're farming endgame armor is just not really good enough. All right, so it looked like it ended up in B. Final vote for Grasp ended up in B, and a lot of votes for C. So it probably is more realistically like a B- overall grade. Why don't we do a new one? What about Spire of the Watcher, chat? I think the mechanics for being involved with the Vex in that sense are interesting, but the actual mechanic itself is pretty basic and bad. And let's be real, the first boss is literally a carbon copy of Garden of Salvation, but you connect some lines before you kill the same boss again that you killed in Garden. On the flip side of the mechanic, doing it as a chill, quick dungeon was pretty fun last season. there was a sense of like progression with the mechanic to like really speed up how fast you could do the dungeon. I think Percy's is a pretty cool fight. I think the setting of the dungeon itself being Western themed and the armor's pretty cool. Better. I mean, the armor's pretty dope, to be fair. But on the flip side of the loot, outside of the Wilderflight, the GL that shoots 2 for the price of 1, like, dude, the long arm's okay. I don't really see it used that much. The sidearm's okay. Don't really see it used all that much. Does anybody use the exotic bow? My vault uses it. Oh, good. Dude, the loot, I'm gonna be real, the loot from Spire's pretty bad. There's not one weapon in that dungeon where I'm like, dude, I need to go farm that this week. I think the solo experience in Spire, I will say, is one of the better of the dungeons. I found it to be decently enjoyable. I felt like the bosses were fair. The splody boys in the boss room were pretty annoying, but I felt like overall, like it wasn't a super time-consuming solo. And the pathing with connecting the nodes was, like, as a solo player, like, being able to speed it up was pretty fun, I think. I don't think the solo experience was bad. I thought the replayability was decent. The loot's kind of meh. The aesthetics cool, but not, like, top tier for me. The mechanics, I felt like, fell really, really flat overall. Dude, where to put Spire? So the majority of you guys voted Spire into C tier. If you could break down these rankings a bit more, I'd probably give it like a C+. I don't think it's a bad dungeon. I think Percy's is a pretty cool fight, but I think it goes below Grasp. Most people saying Prof. We can do Prof. Mechanics. So first boss, I like, to Half-Blood's point, I do like that you can speed up the mechanics. I like the light and dark thing in the opening. I thought that was actually really dope. It's another moat mechanic. Let's be real. It's another Gambit moats mechanic. But at least there was the twist of like the light and dark, which I thought was actually pretty cool. Like, that was actually pretty dope. Rainbow Road, one of the coolest like areas in the game, period. I'm really not a fan of the desert portion. I feel like that is just super drawn out. Cube Room initially, like the first clear of it, cool. Figuring out where Toland is, dunking light, dark, that's whatever. You have to do it 6 times. I love the final boss because it countered Well of Radiance. I feel like Prophecy is one of the few dungeons where like the enemies actually feel decently threatening. The aesthetic, absolutely insane. Rainbow Road, so cool. The light and dark mechanic, so cool. The desert section paying homage to planets that were sunset, super dope. Originally, the Trials of the 9 weapons weren't in the loot pool. I don't know if you guys remember that or not. I don't really know anybody that uses any of those weapons. They are like, in theory, they're decent. I don't think anybody really chases the weapons all that much, though. The other bonus to Prophecy, though, I will say, to Scribby's point, is it was completely free to play. I think Prophecy solo originally was one of the better solo flawless challenges to date because the enemies actually hit really hard, and I actually completely agree with you guys. I don't think Prophecy is S tier strictly because of the loot. It doesn't contain artifice gear, doesn't have a dungeon specific exotic to chase, doesn't have a lot of the modern day stuff associated to it, but I would still put it in A tier because the boss fight is amazing. Easily one of the best aesthetics in the game. The solo flawless emblem's really good. The mechanics are pretty damn decent throughout, I would say. And it's just, I don't know, it's a fun one to run. I like it. We could do Shattered. I'm down to do Shattered. First ever dungeon in the history of Destiny, which I think you have to take into massive account because it was the first of its kind in D2. When it got to the beginning of the 3rd week, when it was at maximum curse, that's when Shattered Throne appeared. Was discovered as a complete secret to all players in the community. It wasn't known that it was coming. It was literally a complete surprise. No one knew what it was. People went into the activity. They were like 30 levels under leveled, getting absolutely destroyed by ads. The lore implications of this dungeon, if we're talking about aesthetic and story, they nail the Taken theme / like throne world feel pretty much perfectly. Now, obviously, it doesn't contain features that other dungeons have now. There's no title associated to it. There's no solo flawless emblem. There's a solo emblem, which people actually get twisted. So this was a solo emblem, not a solo flawless emblem. It also did have a dungeon-specific exotic through Wishender. That hidden quest in Shattered Throne is easily one of the coolest exotic quests that we've gotten in D2 in my opinion. I think the mechanics are relatively simple, but I think the boss fight was super cool before we were like super crazy power crept and you were able to literally one-shot the boss with what seems like literally any weapon or ability now, pretty much. And Vorgith was a cool fight too with the wizards. Like, you're under the time crunch of grabbing the buffs from them, and it just had like that super like crazy eerie aesthetic. Obviously on replay, this dungeon has basically no value. It shares a loot pool with the Dreaming City weapons. The weapons can get some exclusive perks that you can't get outside of Throne. Other than that, the loot pool like is virtually non-existent. I think you have to give it a lot of OG credit for what it did for Destiny being the first. If I had to take this, I would put... I understand, I'm going to put this with a caveat. I understand this is not up to the modern day standards of what dungeons are. What it did for opening the world of dungeons to Destiny and how much they honestly got right for the time in the game, which was what, like 4+ years ago? Plus, the majority of you guys voted for A tier. 24 in A, 24 in B, 6 in S. Okay, we have 4 for Pit. Let's do Pit. I think the environment, in terms of a dungeon, is definitely one of the coolest. So the fact that you can see the boss room, first of all, it's like a massive hive wall cascading down, and you can see the boss room at the very bottom. For those of you who didn't know, that is Zolmak's arena at the very bottom, which is pretty cool. The mechanics are interesting because they were different to anything we had seen prior to Pit. So, like, you have the relic, and you have to interact with the relic in different ways to damage the various types of bosses, which is cool. The second encounter mechanics, it's kind of cool because you have to keep the totem at bay, especially as a solo, like having to go out and grab the orbs and deposit them off of the knights in second encounter is pretty sweet. Like that, like honestly, that encounter was pretty tough as a solo player back in the day. That was like one of the few encounters that actually gave you a challenge. I think the Zolmak mechanics are ass, though. I will say, final boss I thought actually was terrible. It is the same mechanic from the opening encounter, and for the longest time, you didn't even need to do it because there was a ball duping glitch where you could literally just dunk the balls, go to damage, and GG's. You sat in a ring and you shot the boss. Like that was kind of it. So there wasn't much of like an evolution in the mechanics from the opening encounter of Pit to the final boss. I didn't think they did a very good job about that. The loot was literally non-existent. The only thing that this dungeon had going for it at launch was the Xenophage quest, which is one of the coolest things they've ever put into the game. Like, by far. You actually had like a totally unique boss fight with unique mechanics. That is one of the cooler exotic quests, period. The Solo Flawless emblem was really, really cool. I really like the Solo Flawless emblem from Pit. I think it's one of the better ones in the game. You guys can agree or disagree. I think Crimson Echoes is easily like one of the cooler Solo Flawless emblems. The loot didn't exist for about 2 years after the dungeon released. Do you guys think it's better than Spire? Dude, 28 of you guys voting it into B. To be fair, it has been updated, so I guess we're judging the dungeons in their current day, and you can farm high stat armor. I'd probably put it top of C. I don't think it's quite a B tier dungeon for me. I think it's like a C+. Like if I could put it between the two, I would. So I think I'm gonna put it in front of Spire. Chat, what are we saying about Duality? It is a buggy mess. I mean, that is fair. That's fair. But obviously, those are bugs, and I don't think that's not the dungeon's fault. That's just, you know, that's a Bungie moment. I don't know. The mechanics, I will say, I think Keidel's one of the best encounters in the game. I actually really like the Keidel encounter. I'm not a huge fan of the Vault encounter, and I'm not a huge fan of the Galron encounter. But I really do like the bell mechanic overall. Being in like a Callous treasured place and then like going and discovering like his nightmares. I thought that was actually pretty cool. The loot is probably the best loot of any dungeon, I mean, ever, right? You have Storm Chaser, you have Unforgiven, 2 absolutely S tier weapons. Absolutely god tier. The GL Lingering Dread, also just a top tier weapon. Fixed odds is actually very underrated as well. Replayability, you have Hard Shadow. I think it got above. Obviously, that part of the loot's not very good, and I'm not a fan of the Solo Flawless emblem whatsoever. The Artifice armor, #1, being as ridiculously potent as it has been, was the go-to farm literally forever. and the weapons being as elite as they were, you could argue the best loot until Ghost of the Deep came out, which that's going to be up for debate as well. I'm not a fan of this solo flawless emblem. To each their own. I don't think it matches the aesthetic whatsoever. The amount of bugs that this dungeon has had where you're just doing the normal mechanic and it kills you. The solo experience where you're running through and you're doing your solo flawless and you die to a backpack exploding out of nowhere because there's 97 splody backpacks on the ground. The number of enemies that boop you, bro, they couldn't have made that boss room more annoying if they tried. For me personally, I would slot Duality above Prophecy. Pretty much every, like, dude, people were in this dungeon. There's probably more playtime in Duality than any other dungeon. Do I put Duality in S? Dude, chat, why don't we vote? You guys can get in on a vote. So final vote, 27 S tier, 7 A tier, 6 C tier, 6 D tier, 1 B tier. Final dungeon on the list. Ghosts of the Deep. F until I get the exotic. That's crazy, bro. I definitely think people are way overreacting to how much health the bosses have. Within one day, people were farming the first boss, Ekthar. We were one-phasing him consistently. The final boss, Simuma, I think is like legitimately one of the best fights overall in the game. Not just a dungeon, but like even raids as well. I actually think the mechanics in this dungeon are the best of any dungeon, period. I think both bosses in this dungeon are fantastic. I really like both encounters a lot. The opening encounter, if they changed it so that you could do multiple symbols at once, would be actually totally fine and probably decently received by the community because it'd be fast. But the fact that you can only do one symbol at a time is kind of ass in my opinion, and 4 dunks is just way too many. Ziva Arath's voice actor, talking all the way back from when she was Zyro all the way through to current day, all of the aesthetic, diving down below the arcology, I think they did such a good job. The replayability of going through the opening encounter and the water part obviously is not very good. And then the loot, like if you're talking about the loot as well, Cold Comfort rocket launcher that can get 4 in the mag for rocket dumping. The SMG can roll demo incandescent or demo adrenaline junkie. In terms of dungeon exotics, it's the best dungeon exotic that they've ever had. That is the best dungeon armor by a mile. That is Age of Triumph level armor, in my opinion. If they can get Artifice in this armor, like, I personally just don't see how it's not the best dungeon in the game. And I totally am open to you guys voting and disagreeing. The vote from the community, 36 S tier, 3 in A tier, 2B, 1C, 1D. Appreciate you guys participating in the discussion. It was fun. Like, these are always, obviously, like, everybody has huge conflicting opinions with tier lists and D2, but I felt like it was a good time to do it since we've had 2 dungeons come out in the last year that are kind of on opposite ends of the spectrum in terms of what you guys perceived as quality. Anyway, I hope you guys enjoyed the Destiny portion of the stream.